Hello and magandang araw para sa lahat. Welcome back sa Science, Technology, and Society. Again, ako yung professor, si Professor Ryo Tuzon, and today we'll be having lecture number 3 entitled Science, Technology, and Nation Building. Pag-uusapan natin ngayong araw ay yung relationship between science and technology pati yung nation building. Primarily, pag-uusapan natin ng Pilipinas. And pag-uusapan natin ang mga dinaanang pagkakataon o mga situation sa ating society na nagbago ng ating pananaw, ng ating paniniwala, ng ating estado ng science and technology. For the lesson objectives, we have the following lesson objectives. At the end of the lesson, the student should be able to, number 1, explain and analyze the historical timeline and developments of science and technology in the Philippines. Number 2, discuss the role of science and technology in the context of Philippine nation building. Number 3, evaluate government policies pertaining to science technology in terms of the contribution to nation building. And when talking about the science and technology in the Philippines, so pag pinag-uusapan natin ang science and technology sa Pilipinas, magsisimula tayo sa tinatawag nating pre-Hispanic era or the early Filipino science and technology. Ano nga bang science and technology ang meron bago pa man dumating ang mga Espanyol sa Pilipinas? Diba? Mapapaisip ka dumating ang Espanyol and they occupied us for a very long time, pero before that, meron na ba tayo civilization? Meron na ba tayong matinong science and technology? And I am telling you guys, and I am telling the class na meron po tayo. In fact, we had a very good foundation of science and technology way back before the Spanish rule. Early Filipinos already had their own culture and traditions. Meron na po tayong sariling kultura, meron na po tayong sariling mga tradisyon. Meron tayong sariling paniniwala, meron tayong sariling indigenous knowledge na tinatawag. Class, babalikan natin yung tinatawag nating indigenous knowledge mamaya. Pero for now, take note na early Filipinos already had indigenous knowledge and their own systems of belief. Now, meron na rin tayong early methods or own methods of planting their crops that provide them food. In lecture number 1, pinapayawan natin o dinaanan natin sa DLIT yung tinatawag nating Banawe Rice Terraces. The Banawe Rice Terraces, sinabi nga natin before, is an architectural feat in Asia. One of the most advanced form of planting and crop making in Asia. And at that time, before the Spanish came, doon nagawa yung Banawe Rice Terraces. And up until now, we see it as an architectural marvel. Meron na tayong sariling method sa pagpa-plant and wala naman naka-impluwensya sa paggawa nun. Diba? Ang alam natin that early Filipinos, even before the Spanish rule, gumawa ng Banawe Rice Terraces. They already had their own methods of taking care of animals to help them in their daily tasks and in their food production. And lastly, their own form of herbal medicine. Class, their own form of herbal medicine. Kung alam niyo sa mga probinsya and even yung herbal medicine na tinutukoy dito na ginagamit pa rin hanggang sa probinsya. Ginagamit pa rin hanggang ngayon sa mga probinsya. At ano yung herbal medicine na yun? Yung mga albularyo, yung mga ginagamit ng mga albularyo. And somehow, up until now, nagsusurvive yung herbal medicine natin through the albularyos. Sa mga probinsya kung saan limited naman talaga yung healthcare at malalayo yung mga ospital na pupuntahan, madalas sa mga mamamayang Pilipino ay nakaasa sa mga albularyo. And somehow, masasabi natin na effective yung mga methods sa albularyo. Class, hindi ako nagpe-pertain o hindi ko sinasabi yung mga dura o laway o kung ano pa man Ang tinutukoy ko dito ay yung herbal medicine na ginagamit ng mga albularyo. Yung mga dahon, yung mga halaman na ginagamit pang gamot ng mga albularyo hanggang ngayon buhay pa rin sa mga probinsya. And I'm saying to everyone that even before the Spanish came, meron na po tayong understanding nito and meron na po tayong practices using herbal medicine. Next. Now, early Filipino science and technology. Technology is used by people in building houses, irrigations, and in developing tools that they can use in everyday life. They develop tools for planting, hunting, cooking, and fishing, for fighting their enemies during war or tribal conflicts, and for transportation both on land and on waterways. They also develop technologies in creating musical instruments. Plus, if you remember the story of Magellan and the Battle of Mactan, alam nyo pa yon yung ano? Yung laban ni Magellan at Lapu-Lapu? Alam nating lahat na si Lapu-Lapu yung nanalo at that time. Na pinagtataka ng mga tao up until now. Mas advanced in terms of science and technology yung mga Spaniards, and they came to the Philippines knowing that they can conquer the Philippines. Pero at one island, si Lapu-Lapu, he defended the island. Itataka sila, mas advanced ang weaponry namin. It just goes to show na meron din tayong weapons that time. Meron din tayong mga tools and the capability to fight back dahil meron tayong form of technology and science na weaponry. These are evidences na meron tayong science and technology even before the Spaniards came. And speaking of evidences, we have so much evidence that we have our own form of science and technology, one of which is during the Metal Age. Artifacts were found in different regions of the country which signify that early Filipinos utilized these tools in their daily living. Because of these artifacts na nakikita natin, we can also say na meron tayong proof, meron tayong evidence na gumagamit na po ng mga bakal o gumagamit ng metalworks and metallurgy yung mga Filipinos during that time. Now, the early Filipinos already had sophisticated design of gold and silver, jewelry, ceramics, and metal tools. Class, baka meron kayong idea or baka sa isip ninyo na bago dumating ang mga Espanyol, medyo mag-isa ang Pilipinas. Class, that is not the case. Even before the Spaniards came, meron na po tayong trading with other countries sa mga karatig bansa gaya ng China, Indonesia, Japan. Nakikipagpalitan na po tayo ng mga tools, ng mga ideas, ng mga technologies, ng science, and evident ito sa mga artifacts na nakikita natin sa mga parte ng Pilipinas. Dahil yung mga artifacts na ito, they are somewhat similar to other countries' artifacts. Diba? Yung Pilipinas at that time, we're trading with other countries. Nakipagpalitan in exchange for cultural and technological exchange. Nagpapalitan ng culture, nagpapalitan ng technology. Pero siyempre, hindi naman ganun kalaki. Nakikipagpalitan tayo, pero we were not suited for long distance travel, for long ocean travel. Ang meron tayo at marunong tayo that time was short travel. Kaya yung ating mga technology ay base sa mga countries around us. But, then came the Spaniards. When the Spaniards came, they brought with them their own culture and practices. Sinabi natin before na meron ng sariling kultura at meron ng sariling practices ang mga Filipinos bago ang mga Espanyol. Pero pagdating ng Espanyol, well, let's not sugarcoat it. They were the ones to colonize us. At dahil sa colony nila sa atin, nawala yung sarili nating kultura at mga practices. Alam niyo ito pagdating sa ating AP, pagdating sa ating araling panlipunan classes and social science classes. Kung saan nakita niyo na under the Spanish rule, nagkaroon din ng introduction ng practices known as the economic hierarchy. Known as the economic divide. Kung saan nagkaroon ng konsepto that there are people that are rich and there are people that are not rich. And in that sense, merong mga mayayaman at merong mga mahihirap. Yung mga mahihirap, they were treated as slaves. The Spaniards treated or made use of the human resource of the Philippines in terms of labor. And in that sense, yung mga mahihirap nagiging labor para sa mga Espanyol at yung mga mayayaman na Pilipino, they were the ones lucky enough and privileged enough to experience the formal science and technology in the country. Through Catholic schools and through various institutions. But when the Spaniards came, they also allowed us to travel. Life during the Spanish era slowly became modernized, adapting some Western technology and their ways of life. The Filipinos developed ways to replicate the technology brought by the Spaniards using indigenous materials. Medicine and advanced science were introduced in formal colleges and universities established by Catholic orders. Class, at that time, those who were lucky enough or those who were privileged, they were the ones who were able to study. At dahil napag-usapan nga natin before, inibuksan yung possibility of long travel sa Pilipinas dahil sa colony ng Spaniards, this also allowed our privileged Filipinos or the Filipinos who had the means to do so to travel to other countries and study there. Doon tayo nagkaroon ng tinatawag natin mga ilustrado. Saan they studied? Outside the Philippines and in Europe, kumbaga. At sa pag-aaral nila sa Europe o pag-aaral nila sa Western countries, they realized how the Philippines was not free at that time. At dinala nila kanilang mga ideas, ang kanilang mga bagong nalalaman sa medicine, ang kanilang bagong nalalaman sa engineering sa Pilipinas at binalik nila sa mga Pilipino ito. And during that time, classrooms were very different. We can see the economic divide between the teachers and the students. Now, when the Spaniards came, the galleon trade, the galleon trade also happened. The Spaniards brought with them the idea of the galleon trade. O yung tinatawag natin ngayon as kalakalang galyon. Although it is only beneficial for the Spaniards, these trades allowed other ideas, crafts, tools, culture and practices, technology and Western practices to reach the country. Some Filipino students who were able to study in Europe also contributed to the advancement of medicine, engineering, arts, music, and literature in the country. Plus, yung galleon trade, beneficial lang yan para sa mga Spaniards at that time. What I am saying is they were the ones to benefit from the trading and they were the ones who benefit from the products of the Filipinos. Ine-exploit ng mga Spanish yung ating natural resources. Kasi in reality, maganda ang natural resources natin. Diverse ang Pilipinas at ideal ang ating klima o climate for crops to grow. At dahil dyan, the Spanish abused our natural resources and they traded with other countries from our own resource. Kumbaga, kinuha nila yung natural resources natin tapos binenta sa mga ibang lugar o nakipagpalitan mula ay sa mga ibang bansa. And yung kinita nila, hindi naman nila binigay sa Pilipino. Sa kanila lang yun. Ganun ang sitwasyon during the Spanish era. Pero, class, silver lining, yung mga trades na ito, nagbukas din ang mata ng mga Pilipino. Kasi, yung mga tao sa loob ng mga barko, ng mga malalaking barko sa Kalakalangaryon, mula sa mga western countries. At dahil tao ang pinag-uusapan natin, they also brought with them ideas, cultural practices, and technology. Nagkakaroon ng mga pagkakataon na nagkakaroon ng sharing of ideas. And yung mga Pilipino ay natututo mula sa mga Navy men o mula sa mga seamen galing sa mga ibang bansa. Kaya maraming Pilipino, hindi lang yung mga ilustrados ang mga namulat ang mata. Even those who were not able to go to other countries also experienced and also learned new ideas from people of other countries. But, yung mga privileged natin Filipinos or the Filipino students who were able to study in Europe, they were the ones to contribute greatly. Sila yung nagbigay ng malaking contribution at malaking ambag, kumbaga, sa idea ng engineering, medicine, arts, music, and literature sa bansang Pilipinas. The Philippines, being one of the centers of global trade in Southeast Asia during that time, was considered to be one of the most developed places in the region. Dahil din sa Kalakalangalyon, nakitanyag ang Pilipinas dahil sikat na sikat at ang daming trading ang nangyayari sa Port of Manila. Kaya nga tayo tinawag na Pearl of the Orient ng mga Western countries. Dahil sa likas na yaman natin na available, pero, again, yung reality is that we have the natural resources, but the Spaniards were the one who benefits or are the one who benefits from our natural resources. Although the country is blessed with the developments, the superstitious beliefs of the people and the Catholic doctrines and practices during the Spanish era halted the growth of science and in the country. Class, if you've read the El Filibusterismo or the Noli Me Tangere, you have an idea kung paano na titigil ang developments of ideas, ang developments of the Filipinos because of the Catholic rule or the Spaniard rule with the Catholic rules, kumbaga. Sa pagsakop ng mga Espanyol, nahinto po o nagkaroon ng limitations ang ating ability when it comes to science and technology. Plus, ganito yung ruta ng Kalakalangalyon during that time. And yung mga barko ay ganun kamamassive. Sobrang laki. Kung napanood ninyo yung mga pirate movies, gaya ng Pirates of the Caribbean, ganun kalalaki yung mga barko during that time. Diba? From 1565 to 1815, Spanish galleons loaded with exotic goods left Manila to Acapulco. Papuntang Acapulco. Diba? Kinukuha nila yung mga goods natin mula sa Manila, dinadala sa Japan, nakikipag-trading sa Japan, at dinadala pa sa Amerika. At the first hint of the land of the ships turned south to avoid dangerous and often fog-shrouded coast of Oregon and California, then unloading in Acapulco. At babalik din sa Manila. Nangyayari ito dahil sa tinatawag nating trade winds. Meron kasi tayong mga hangin o mga current, yung hangin natin sa Pacific Ocean. And dahil sa mga hangin na yon, mas napapabilis yung trading papuntang Maynila. Kaya nga tayo ideal na place. Kasi yung hangin, yung trade winds, yun yung nagkikerry ng barko mula sa Mexico o mula sa western countries papunta sa Pilipinas. Kaya mas mabilis na nakaka-travel. And during that time, we were also known as Asia's melting pot. Di ba? Class, tinatawag din tayong Asia's melting pot. Bakit? Dahil sa diversity ng ating culture. Dahil nga sobrang daming kalakalan ang nangyayari sa Pilipinas during that time, yung mga kultura, yung mga practices, they stayed with us up until the modern times. Kaya nga ang daming iba't ibang klase or sobrang dami nating iba't ibang influences mula sa iba't ibang bansa ay dahil sa mga trading na nangyayari when the Spaniards introduced this concept of trading. But nonetheless, this also allowed us to produce the ilustrados or the people or the Filipinos that allowed us to open our minds in terms of the ideas and of the Western technology that they had during that time. Ito si Jose Rizal, Marcelo del Pilar at si Mariano Ponce and the other ilustrados at that time. And kung papansinin natin yung pormahan, anong pormahan? Westernized po, mga Amerikano ang suot. Amerikano yung term natin, di ba? Pero hindi naman limited sa Amerika yon. Na mga pormahan mula sa Western countries and mula sa iba't ibang bansa na kinabibilangan ang Spain. When the Americans came, medyo iba ang naging datingan. The Americans have more influence in the development of science and technology in the Philippines compared to the Spaniards. Plus, nung dumating ang mga Amerikano, ibang-iba yung kanilang pakitungo sa Pilipinas. To be frank with you guys and to be magiging franco lang ako sa inyo, ang mga Amerikano ay pumunta sa Pilipinas with the idea na meron silang investment sa Pilipinas. And anong ibig sabihin ng investment, class? Ang investment po, ibig sabihin, magbibigay ka ng pera sa isang bagay and in return, alam mo na ibabalik sa'yo ng mas malaki yung pera na yon. We are all young professionals. I'm sure that you're aware kung ano yung konsepto ng investment. And in fact, yun ang naging idea ng mga Amerikano sa Pilipinas. Ang ginawa nila, they wanted to improve the Philippines. Diba? And in that sense, they established the public education system. Sa Spaniards, merong privatized section or privatized lang yung knowledge, di ba? Para sa mayayaman lang. Yung mga Amerikano, nakita nila yung knowledge and the science and technology to be for everyone. Kaya merong mga public school system. And the public school system, aside from that, they also discovered or they made a research university, also known now as the University of the Philippines, and created more public hospital than the former colonial master. Ang mga Spaniards during that time, they privatized education para sa mayayaman lang. Nagkaroon tayo ng konsepto na public education dahil sa mga Amerikano. And this allowed all or most Filipinos to study science and technology. And class, kaya natin pinag-aaralan at kaya natin nabanggit ito, yung mga classrooms sa Pilipinas, dahil ang foundation po ng science and technology is the classroom. Ang foundation po nito is the science education and the quality of education each person experiences in the Philippines. Aside from that, they also introduced the idea of mineral resources. Ano naman yung mineral resources, sir? Nagkaroon po ng idea na gamitin yung mga lupa, gamitin yung mga produkto mula sa Pilipinas para din sa Pilipinas. Nga lang, explored and exploited po. Nag-mine ng mga Amerikano and they taught us mining to an extent na mining in terms of walang pakundangan, walang concern for sustainable living. Kaya ang nangyari that time, they mined provinces. Kinuha nila yung mga lupa, kinuha nila yung resources mula sa probinsya at dinala sa Manila at para i-develop ang Manila. One good example of this is the Jones Bridge in Manila in 1920s, di ba? May nabasa ako sa Facebook, nagsabi na yung Jones Bridge daw mula kay Marcos. Hindi po. Ang reality was that Jones Bridge was made under the American regime or under the American rule to improve our transportation that time. Pero, yung Manila lang po yung na-develop. In return, yung mga provinces sa Pilipinas na-exploit at yung Manila na-develop ng agaran. Kaya nga hanggang ngayon, nandiyan pa rin yung konsepto ng mga matatanda and even some people in the provinces that Manila is open for opportunities. Na ang Manila, dyan ka makakakuha ng magagandang klase. In reality, hindi na po ganun yung kaso. Marami na po mga karatig cities kung saan makakakuha ka ng good lifestyle and even a better form of living. When the Americans came, they also did everything to Americanize the Philippines. They reorganized our learning of science and introduced sila yung idea of public and private schools. And dito rin po tayo nagkaroon ng unang konsepto and unang subject na tinatawag na natin na science. Pero, nandun pa rin po yung konsepto na they wanted to colonize us. Kaya nga, during that time, classrooms had flags of America. American flags po ang winawagayway sa mga classrooms during that time. But during the American time or during the American colony, they also taught science in higher education institutions. Science was also greatly improved and modernized. Researches were done to control malaria, cholera, and tuberculosis and other tropical diseases. During that time, dun pa lang tayo nagkaroon ng pagkakataon na mag-research sa bansa natin. Na maggawa ng mga laboratory activities sa hindi naman natin previously nagagawa. Diba? And lastly, the desire of the Americans to develop the human resources of the Philippines to serve their own interests is somehow beneficial in the country. Ang reality dyan, gusto tayong maging labor workers ng American colonial era. Ang gusto ng mga Amerikano, sila yung mga nasa taas, pero tayo yung mga nasa mababa. Tayo yung mga nagtatrabaho para sa kanila. Pero during that time, dahil modernized na nga, kailangan nila tayong pag-aralin para tayo yung magtrabaho para sa kanila. Pero somehow, beneficial to sa atin dahil nang umalis ang mga Amerikano, naiwan sa atin yung mga ideas, yung mga knowledge, yung mga education na meron tayo. Gaya dito yung abaca farming during that time. Meron tayong paghahabi and even the media. Pero again, class, sinasabi ko sa inyo na investment po ang trato sa atin during that time. And alam natin na kapag may investment, meron tayong tinatawag na return of investment. Nang dumating ang World War II sa Pilipinas, hindi natin inaasahan. Or actually, inaasahan natin. Bakit? During that time, the American country was in war or was at war with Japan. At dahil ang Pilipinas ay malapit sa Japan, and tayo yung colony ng Amerikano during that time, ano nangyari? The Philippines became a war zone. During that time, sobrang dami pong lives, sobrang daming structure, sobrang daming houses ang nasira. Dahil tayo yung naging lugar kung saan nagkaroon ng barilan, kung saan nagkaroon ng wars ang Amerikano and ang Japan. During World War II, we became the satellite for America. Therefore, we were the ones who were destroyed during that time. Titignan ninyo nagka-war ang Amerikano at Japan. Ang Japan na binomba, di ba? Nandyan yung Hiroshima bombing, nandyan yung Nagasaki bombing. Nasira yung Japan. Nasira ba ang Amerika? Hindi. Ano nasira? Hawaii? Na malapit lang din sa Pacific Ocean na parte ng Japan? Parte ng Amerika? Hawaii nasira? Ang Pilipinas nasira din. Hindi tayo Amerika. Pero during that time kasi, under American rule tayo. Kaya meron tinatawag tayong return of investment kasi kapalit ng information and improvements in science and technology ang nangyari po, Manila was destroyed. The Americans destroyed Manila in 1945. Dati tayong kilala as Pearl of the Orient. Pero pagdating po ng World War II, nagbago na po. Dahil nagkaroon ng wars at ang nangyari po, when the Americans destroyed the Philippines, iniwan po nila tayo sa ere. Dahil sila rin mismo kailangan mag-recover economically. Naiwan po tayo, ang Pilipinas, to fend for ourselves. At kanina nga, sinasabi ko sa inyo na sila yung mga nasa taas. Kumbaga, sa isang ospital, sila yung mga doktor, tayo yung mga taga-alalay ng doktor. Tayo yung mga janitor. At nang umalis yung mga Amerikano, umalis yung mga doktor, umalis yung mga engineer, umalis yung mga mathematicians na meron tayo. Kaya ang nangyari, naiwan tayo without the manpower, without the human resource to develop the country of our own. Sirang-sira nga yung country natin. The New Republic. Since the establishment of the New Republic, the whole nation has been focusing on using its limited resources and improving science and technological capability. Dahil nga ito yung kulang natin. Pagdating ng New Republic, we tried to improve our own science and technology capability. Gumamit lang tayo ng tinatawag nating ODA or Overseas Development Allocation. Human resource development is at the heart of these efforts. Kailangan na natin makaproduce ng sarili nating engineers, scientists, technology experts, doctors, and other professionals. Dahil nga sobrang konti during that time. Dahil ang gusto nga ng mga Amerikano, sila yung mga nasa taas, tayo yung mga nasa baba. The development of science and technology in the Philippines, based on its brief history, is shaped by several factors and influences. That is the development of science and technology in the Philippines, and science and technology is continually being developed in the Philippines. Na pag-uusapan natin later on. But take note, ng science and technology in the Philippines is influenced by several influences. We have the internal influences, survival, culture, economic activity. Meron din tayong external influences, meron tayong foreign colonizers, trades with foreign countries, and international economic demands. And each of these influences have an effect on the Philippines in the development of our own science and technology. Now, let's focus on the New Republic. Let's focus on the now. What are the government policies on science and technology? Plus, during the New Republic, we joined with other Southeast Asian countries to develop what is known as the ASEAN right now. Diba? Alam natin yung ASEAN term, Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Diba? Nakikita natin to sa mga pag-aaral natin ng AP, pag-aaral natin ng social sciences. And, meron kasi tayong goal na, or first and foremost, yung sa atin muna. Anong goal natin? Anong goal ng government? Ang goal ng government natin is to boost the area of science and technology. And para ma-boost ito, we must capacitate our own people in a world driven by science. That is why, kailangan natin sumunod sa ASEAN. Kailangan natin makipag-partner up at makipaggrupo sa mga countries na somehow kabilang natin para i-improve yung sariling knowledge natin when it comes to science and technology. And at that time, yung DOST natin, sinabi nga natin na si Corazon Aquino developed the DOST right after the World War II and right after the Commonwealth era. Diba? The DOST sought the expertise or hinanap po at nagkumonsulta po sa expertise ng National Research Council of the Philippines to develop and to study how the Philippines can prepare itself in meeting the ASEAN 2015 goals. Dahil nga parte tayo ng ASEAN 2015, we must do our efforts to achieve the goals of ASEAN during that time in terms of science, technology, and innovation. Siyempre, marami pang goals ang ASEAN aside sa science and technology. Pero doon tayo magpo-focus sa ating klase na science, technology, and society. During that time, the goals was to improve the innovation or ASEAN innovation for the global market. We must improve water management. We must improve the digital economy and social network, science and innovation for life, green technology, biodiversity for health and wealth, and food security and energy security. Ito yung kailangan natin mahabol sa ASEAN according sa Krabi Initiative, the science and technology and innovation for a competitive, sustainable, and inclusive ASEAN. Yan yung goals natin. And ano yung mga policies na ginawa ng NCRP para ma-achieve yung goals na ito? Ito yung mga yon. Meron tayong 4 clusters. Meron tayong social sciences, humanities, education, international policies, and governance. Di ba? Kailangan daw nating i-integrate ang ASEAN sa basic education. Kaya nga nung mga bata tayo, or nung high school tayo, or even nung elementary tayo, meron tayong ASEAN or ASEAN topics na pinag-uusapan. Di ba? Next, emphasizing teaching din the mother tongue. Kaya tayo biglang nagkaroon ng mother tongue language or mother tongue subject sa ating K-12 education. In response po yun and in compliance sa ASEAN demands. Oo, it's good that we can benefit from this, but in return, nakakatulong din tayo at nakakasabay din tayo sa mga plano, sa mga goals ng ASEAN. Developing school infrastructure and providing for ICT broadband, and lastly, local food security. Physics, engineering, and industrial research in earth and space sciences and mathematics. We must emphasize degrees, licenses, and employment opportunities. Kailangan magkaroon ng grants for peer monitoring. And nagkaroon din tayo or meron din tayong review of RA 9184. And lastly, harnessing science and technology as an independent mover of development. Next, we have medical, chemical, and pharmaceutical sciences. No? Kailangan nating i-ensure yung compliance sa drug manufacturing firms natin sa ASEAN standards. Ginagawa ito ng FDA or Food and Drug Administration. So yung standards mo ng FDA, galing po yan sa ASEAN natin. Next, kailangan natin makagawa ng Education Council dedicated to the standardization of pharmaceutical services and care. We must empower the food and drug agencies to conduct evidence-based research. And lastly, allocating 2% of the GDP to research and legislating a law supporting Human Genome Project. Kaya po tayo nagkaroon bigla ng mga generic companies like the generic pharmacy or Ryo generics, dahil ito yung mga in compliance Although these are privately owned businesses, we can say that we are following the pharmaceutical sciences sector of the NCRP dahil sa mga dahil sa mga companies like these. And in fact, meron na rin tayo Human Genome Project. Ano ba Human Genome Project? Ito yung pag-plot out, pag-alam ng ating genetics, ng genetic makeup ng isang tao. At meron tayong sariling laboratories, sariling methodologies, and sariling mga paraan para gawin ito. And lastly, biological sciences, agriculture, and forestry. By protecting and conserving biodiversity by full implementation of existing laws, the use of biosafety and standard model, promoting indigenous knowledge systems sa pag-uusapan natin later on, and indigenous people conservation. And lastly, formulation of common food and safety standards. Now, in the DOST, we also have many programs that they are using, that they are making. Not only for ASEAN, but for the Philippines. Meron tayong providing of funds, di ba? Sa mga researches in terms of science and technology, you may seek funding from the DOST. Pwede ka makakuha ng pondo mula sa DOST. At nanggagaling iyon sa Overseas Development Aid. Next, providing scholarships for undergraduate and graduate studies. Dahil the foundation nga ng science and technology natin is science education, we must provide scholarships. At nangyayari, ang mga scholarships na ito dahil sa DOST. In fact, class, ako nga isang naka-benefit mula sa scholarships mula sa DOST, and my masteral is under the DOST scholarship. Next, establishing more branches of Philippine Science High School System. And finally, creating science and technology parks. Ano pa? More programs. Balik Scientist Program kung saan nag-encourage yung DOST na bumalik ang mga Pilipino sa Pilipinas para maglingkod at para tumulong in terms of science and technology sa pagre-research, sa mga projects and sa mga ginagawang collaboration with Philippine-based scientists. Developing science and technology parks and the establishment of the National Science Complex and National Engineering Complex. One good, solid example of this was in April 2021. In April 2021, the agribusiness firm gets almost 3 million aid from DOST for plant tissue culture lab. Dahil nga, ang gusto ng DOST is to develop our own science and technology, the Greenland Agritech Venture was one of the first, or actually the first companies in the Philippines who had a plant tissue culture lab. At gustong i-improve ng DOST ito. As such, binigyan ng almost 3 million pesos in aid para matulungan at para magkaroon ng laboratory expansion and diversification ang Greenland Agritech Ventures. Now, there are many forms or many government policies on science and technology according to PAASE. Ano? So, meron din yung mga reforms and meron din mga capacity building program ang ginawa ang PAASE para ma-develop ang science and technology natin. Nandiyan yung Centers of Excellence, nandiyan yung Manpower and Institutional Development Programs, nandiyan yung Regional Centers to support specific industries, Science and Technology Business Centers, and strengthening the science education of the Philippines. Meron din tayong pag-develop ng new science-related courses. Nandiyan din yung K-12 natin na merong STEM track o Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics track. And lastly, the PICARI or the projects or the program that allows students in higher education in the Philippines to study abroad for the use of their laboratories, of their researches and of their resources. There are many other areas na kailangan nating i-look forward at kailangan nating pag-aralan in terms of science and technology. Ito yung use of alternative and safe energy. Ito yung harnessing mineral resources. Ito yung finding cure for various diseases and illnesses. Nandiyan yung climate change and global warming, increasing food production, preservation of natural resources, coping with natural disasters and calamities, and the infrastructure development. These are the ideas that we want to study in terms of science and technology. Now, science and technology has many. The development of policies, programs, and projects in science and technology has many influences. Diba? Yung mga influence ito, yung national goals, international treaties, legal frameworks, and even the social needs, issues, and problems that are in the Philippines. Lahat po ito ay nakakaapekto sa development ng programs, policies, and projects of science and technology in the country. Now, let's try to look at some famous Filipinos in the field of science. Li Chua in 2000 identified 10 outstanding Filipino scientists during that time. Okay, ito yung mga scientists na yon. Number 1, Ramon Cabanos Barba for his outstanding research on the tissue culture in Philippine mangoes. Number 2, Josefino Cacas Comiso for his work in observing the characteristics of Antarctica. Number 3, Jose Behar Cruz Jr., known internationally in the field of electrical engineering and was elected officer of the famous Institution of Electrical and Electronic Engineering. We have Lourdes Jansoy Cruz, notable for her research on sea snail venom. Nandyan din si Fabian Millar Dairit for his research on herbal medicine. Nandyan si Rafael Dineros Guerrero III for his research on tilapia culture. We have Enrique Mapua Ostrea Jr. for inventing the meconium drugs testing. We have Lilian Formalejo Padena for doing research on plant biotechnology. And Marijo Panginiban Cruz for being an outstanding educator and graph theorist. And lastly, Gregory Ligot Tangonan for his research in the field of communication technology. Now, meron tayong tinatawag ng the hows and whys of a Filipino scientist. Plus, ang Filipino scientist has many influences. Primarily, nandyan yung individual interest in science, family, and natural environment. At itong mga influences na ito, for example, gusto mong mag-engineer as a person, as a Filipino. In fact, suportado ka ng pamilya mo, sige mag-engineer ka na. And yung natural environment mo, sa probinsya mo, wala pang engineer. So, ang laki ng driving force mo, gusto mo talaga mag-engineer. Pero, class, kahit anong gusto natin, meron tayong tinatawag na sieve, S-I-E-V-E. Sala, nagsasala po ng mga gusto natin. And in fact, kahit anong gusto mo, kung for example, hindi mo afford yung school science, kung hindi talaga pasok sa budget yung pagiging engineer, wala tayong magagawa. The real life context, the teacher and learning environment, these are influences that affect the hows and whys of a Filipino scientist. Balik tayo sa early science and technology in the Philippines. Balik tayo sa indigenous science and technology in the Philippines. Class, Filipinos, especially during the early times, tried to invent tools that will help them in everyday life. They also developed alternative ideas in explaining various phenomena and in explaining the world around them. This system of knowledge, which is a foundation of indigenous science. Ano ba yung tinatawag nating indigenous science? Pag-usapan natin ang tinatawag nating indigenous knowledge system. Class, ang indigenous knowledge, ito yung mga information, ito yung mga data, ito yung mga methodology na alam natin at embedded sa buhay natin. Bakit? Dahil sa kultura. Dahil sa mga tao sa paligid natin, ito yung alam nila, therefore ito rin yung alam natin. Ang indigenous knowledge system, ito yung mga information and data galing sa society natin. Ito yung mga pinapractice. For example, yung pagtuli. Yung circumcision class, isa siyang practice sa kultura natin. And alam natin lahat na kailangan natin gawin ito. Mamamatay ka ba pag hindi mo ginawa ito? Hindi naman. Pero alam natin lahat na ito dapat yung gawin natin kasi ito yung practice na ginawa natin, kinasayanayan natin, buong buhay natin, and mga buhay din ng mga ninuno natin. Embedded yan sa daily life natin. Yung methodology na yan kung paano ginagawa yan sa mga probinsya, for example, kung saan hindi naman malalapit yung mga ospital, nakakapagpatuloy pa rin. Dahil yung practice kung paano ginagawa yon, pinapasa-pasa po sa isang kultura. Their parents and other older folks served as their first teachers. And their methods of teaching are very effective in transmitting cultural knowledge in their minds. Meron tayong mga kultura, meron tayong mga information na nakukuha natin mula sa mga magulang natin, for example, mula sa paligid natin, mula sa kapitbahay natin, and yun ang tinatawag natin indigenous knowledge system. Hindi yung mga chika class, ha? Yung indigenous knowledge system, ito yung mga original information, original data, original na alam natin mula sa ating mga magulang, mula sa mga probinsya natin. For example, yung mga paggawa ng salakot, paggawa ng mga sombrero, mula sa mga dahon. Hindi naman, kung for example, i-google mo yan, hindi mo naman makikita kung paano gawin yan sa Google. Pero paano nalalaman ng mga tao ito? Dahil pinapasa-pasa po yung ideas sa probinsya. Pinapasa-pasa po from generation to generation yung mga data and information na ito. That is why indigenous knowledge system does not die. Hindi nawawala. Hanggat pinapractice po natin yan, yan po ang nagiging original science sa Pilipinas. Yan ang pagkakakilanlan sa atin. These lessons or the lessons they learned are intimately interwoven with their culture and environment. For example, si Apo Wangod. Yung idea ng pagbabatik. Saan ba nakuha ni Apo Wangod yun? Eh di sa mga tao sa paligid niya rin, sa mga previous generation niya rin. At ngayon, alam natin na meron siyang pamangkin ba o apo na nagpa-practice din ng pagbabatik o pagtatato. Dahil nga mahina na siya, pero naipapasa yung cultural knowledge. Nagkakaroon ng cultural information, cultural exchange. At ito yung mga practices at ito yung mga information na tinatawag nating indigenous knowledge. The lessons they learned are intimately interwoven with their culture and environment. And alam natin, class, right now, as young professionals, meron na rin po tayong indigenous knowledge system. Kung paano po nangyayari or paano po ang mga bagay-bagay para sa sarili natin, para sa probinsya natin, or mula sa probinsya natin, and mula sa mga previous generations of our people. These lessons are comprised with good values and life stories of people and their daily life struggles. And these are reflected and evident in stories, poems, and songs. Yung indigenous knowledge, embedded yan usually sa mga songs. For example, sa Bahay Kubo, sinasabi yung mga different fruits and vegetables na dapat mong kainin para maging nutritious. Wala ka namang idea ng tinatawag nating micronutrients. Wala kang idea ng vitamins and minerals. Pero alam mo na tama kainin yung mga pagkain na nasa Bahay Kubo because these are all nutritional food. And there are many other examples, di ba? Of how embedded this information, this science is in our everyday lives. In the Philippines, maraming indigenous people. And bawat indigenous people, meron po silang sari-sariling indigenous knowledge systems, including the Ifugao of the Cordillera region. The Ifugao tribe continued to thrive in their relatively remote yet self-sufficient community. Magtataka kayo. Bakit ganun, sir? Hindi naman sila marunong when it comes to modern technology. Hindi naman sila Wala naman silang data mula sa kung paano gumamit ng smartphone efficiently. Hindi naman sila marunong gumawa ng Microsoft Excel. Hindi naman sila marunong gumawa ng Microsoft Word. Paano sila nabubuhay, sir? They are alive because they are self-sustainable. Hindi na nila kailangan makipag-compete sa global market kasi sila themselves or they themselves, they have their own ways of having their own basic needs, having their own complex needs, and accomplishing the hierarchy of needs according to Abraham Maslow na pinag-usapan natin before. Kaya na nila sustentuhan sarili nila eh. Hindi na nila kailangan maghanap ng iba. Yung indigenous knowledge nila, sobrang diverse at sobrang laki to a point that they don't need to have influences, to have knowledge from other people in the country. Notwithstanding the transformation of many indigenous knowledge systems in science and technology, they practice and promote forest sustainability. At dahil self-sustainable sila, they can survive and thrive at their own. The indigenous knowledge system has many other forms. For example, predicting weather conditions. Magtataka ka sa lolo at lola mo. Di ba? Nung bata tayo, sabihin niyan, uulan mamaya. Maligo ka na lang sa ulan. And magtataka ka. Paano mo nalalaman yan, lolo? Paano mo nalalaman yan, lola? Pero tama siya. Bigla nga umulan mamaya. Yung predictions na mga ganung bagay, indigenous knowledge din yun. And in fact, I'm sure na, or at least I'm hoping, na lahat tayo familiar dun. Kapag maalinsangan po, malaki yung chance na uulan mamaya. And as young professionals na exposed sa mga ganung klaseng knowledge, alam natin na nagagamit natin yung mga knowledge na yun. Nagagamit natin yung mga information na yun. Using herbal medicine, preserving foods. Kaya nga sobrang, sa herbal medicine, kaya nga sobrang patok sa mga matatanda, sa mga tumatandang Pilipino, ng tinatawag nating herbal. May mayoma, herbal mo na yan. Diba? May sakit, herbal mo na yan. Kahit wala naman silang ina-approved therapeutic claims. Plus, pag sinabi yung term na no approved therapeutic claims, ibig sabihin po, wala siyang proven na benefit. Yung benefit niya ay nakabase sa minerals na meron dito, pero wala siyang proven na benefit when it comes to curing diseases. Kaya ang herbal can be a supplement, pero it is not as effective as medicine. Plus kasi ang medicine, galing din naman yan sa dahon. Galing din naman yan sa mga halaman. Huwag kayong matatakot gumamit ng gamot, sabihin nyo synthetic. Plus, that is not the case. Ang gamot, galing din po yan sa mga halaman. Ini-extract lang yung chemical. Ini-extract lang yung katas. Kumbaga, yung katas, kukunin mo pa yung mga specific elements mula sa katas at yun yung ginagawa mong gamot. In a way, all medicine are herbal. Or most medicine are herbal. Kasi yung iba, galing sa mga chemistry output or chemistry research din. Pero class, huwag kayong matatakot sa gamot, sabihin nyo hindi herbal yan. Herbals are good when it comes to supplementing. But medicines are better when it comes to curing or for treating. Preserving foods, classifying plants and animals, preserving, selecting good seeds for planting. Balik tayo sa classifying plants or animals. Sa mga probinsya natin, alam nila yung mga halaman na pwedeng kainin at hindi pwedeng kainin. And bilang taga Manila o Manila boy, kapag ako nagkaroon ng pagkakataong bumisita sa mga probinsya. Nang bumisita ako sa Aurora, doon ako nakatikim ng tinatawag nating pako. And magtataka ka eh. Yung pako, kamukha ng ibang fern, pero sinasabi nila, ito pako to, ito hindi to nakakain. Hindi mo alam. Siyempre, taga Manila ako, hindi ko alam. Pero sila, they have their own methods of finding out. Meron silang sariling indigenous knowledge system. Meron naman sa Bulusan, sa Sorsogon. Meron silang tinatawag na palawan, na pagkain. Para siyang kamoting kahoy, pero mas gusto ko siya kasi mas crispy siya. Pero, class, nalaman ko na mahirap pala yung proseso ng pagkuha nito. Kung hindi ka marunong, hindi mo makukuha yung tinatawag na palawan. Kasi sobrang tinik po ng palawan, tapos kailangan mong balatan agad kasi nagiging toxic siya o nakakalason siya kapag tumagal siya nang hindi mo pinoproseso. 'Di ba? Yun yung mga indigenous knowledge systems. Paggawa ng mga wines and juices, yung tuba, yung lambanog. Kahit mag-research ka po sa Google, hindi mo malalaman kung paano gumawa ng tuba o lambanog. Mas mainam pa na magtanong ka sa mga matatanda, magtanong ka sa mga taga-probinsya kung paano gawin itong mga alak na ito o itong mga inumin na ito para makagawa ka ng sarili mo. Yan yung mga indigenous knowledge system. And lastly, keeping the custom of growing plants and vegetables in the yard. The concept of indigenous science uses science process skills. Class, yung mga nalalaman ng mga ninuno natin, mga nalalaman natin ngayon about indigenous science, these are all processes or nagmula ito sa science process skills, but they are guided by the community culture and values, and they are composed of traditional knowledge. Today, we talked about science, technology, and nation building. We talked about science and technology in the Philippines in different eras. During the early pre-Hispanic period, during that Spanish time or the Spanish colonization, and during the American period, and even the New Republic. We talked about the government policies that we have in terms of science and technology, and we talked about famous scientists in the Philippines. We also talked about indigenous knowledge systems and indigenous science that are somehow the identity of the Philippines when it comes to science. Which brings us to activity 1.3. Directions: answer each of the essay questions with 5 to 8 sentences each. Be sure to elaborate your answers as well as make full use of our time. So these are the questions for activity 1.3. Number 1, do you think indigenous science should be considered as a science? Why or why not? Number 2, what is the role of indigenous science in the development of science and technology in the Philippines and in the world? And lastly, how will the concepts of indigenous science be used in developing sustainable development mindset? Class, I really do hope that you learned something in our lecture video for today. And as a reminder, you need to complete every activities that we have before our prelim exam next week. And if you have any questions regarding our topic, regarding the activity, you are free to ask them in our group chat in Messenger, and you are free to ask them in our Google Classroom. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you have a very nice day. Goodbye, class.